All right, so thank you everyone for your patience. So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for being here today. So as you know, my name is Julia and I'm a PhD candidate at the Wageningen University at the Knowledge, Technology and Innovation Chair Group. And today's talk will focus on my recent article entitled Backed by Popular Demand Ontology, Productive Tensions Between Anthropological and Philosophical Approaches to Ontology, which I co-authored with David Ludwig, and which is the first chapter of my dissertation. But first, let me just introduce the research project in which I work, which is kind of the scaffolding and the context for my own work. So the Global Epistemologies and Ontologies Project, or GEOS, as we call it for short, commenced in 2020 and is institutionally located at the Knowledge, Technology and Innovation Chair Group at Wageningen University. But we maintain strong ties to other research institutions as well, such as LEFHBio at the Federal University of Bahia, as well as UNAM in Mexico City, and the Center for Indigenous Knowledge and Organizational Development in Ghana, and also other institutions. And our work brings together diverse methodologies and forms of expertise to investigate global negotiations of knowledge and socio-environmental challenges. And we aim to understand heterogeneous knowledge about socio-environmental systems by equally heterogeneous actors, from indigenous farmers to lab scientists. And here on the slide, you can see some of my brilliant colleagues, and I invite you all to our website to get more information about each of the projects, because everybody is doing great work. And moving on to my individual project. So my academic background is in cognitive science and logic, philosophy of language, and analytic philosophy. So that's what I did before. And in my work, I use these lenses as well as other paradigms, most prominently anthropological theory, ethnography, and experimental philosophy to investigate questions from the geosphere and of interest. And more specifically, I ask how the theoretical and practical concerns in the context of co-construction of knowledge can influence each other. And the first part of my thesis focuses on the theoretical dimension of this question. So you have this on the right side. And here I look into what it actually means that communities differ from each other at the level of knowledge. And I look at how different academic debates address this diversity. And the second part of the thesis is concerned with how this co-production of knowledge works in practice. And in this, I heavily collaborate with many of you here from LEFHBio at Ufba. And I completed my fieldwork in a fishing community of Suribinha in the north of Bahia state in Brazil. But unfortunately, due to time constraints, as well as the fact that the second part of the thesis is very much under development, today I will focus exclusively on my conceptual work. So I hope it will still be interesting to you. But before I dive into that, let us reflect for a moment for what it means to say that there exist many kinds of knowledges. So on this slide, I put together a collage of my personal experiences with different types of knowledge. And while I go through them briefly, I would like to invite you to reflect on your own experiences with diverse forms of knowledge. And diverse forms of expertise and production practices. So starting from the left column, we have two images from various academic activities, actually. One from a community meeting in Suribinha, which happened last year, around that time of the year, actually, about exactly a year ago. And the second one is from a conference on modal logic in Amsterdam. But surely, and I think uncontroversially, knowledge production occurs outside of academic environments as well. So in the top right corner, I put a picture of my favorite meal prepared by my grandma, who is here today, which makes this seminar very special to me, consisting of meatballs garnished with a baked apple slice, some cooked beetroot, and some potatoes. And trust me when I say that she's a true expert in making this meal and in many other things as well. And then on the bottom right, we have a poster prepared by the community members in Ceribinha, which was done to collect and spread information about the 2019 oil spill, which happened in this part of the Atlantic coast. And it had some very serious effects on the environment, as well as the key economic activity, which is fishing. And also on the poster, you can see a message of political solidarity. So based on these images, we can already put together a list of concepts which relate to diverse forms of knowledge. And among those, we can name care, tradition, information, politics, play, community, expertise, dialogue, teaching, university, and economics. So in the history of Western philosophy, all questions related to knowledge would be addressed via the label of epistemology, which means no more than the study of when can we say that somebody knows something. So in this context, when faced with diversity of knowledge, we might say that a person knows just simply different people know different things. And we might use the concept listed here on the slide to describe this diversity. So for instance, that someone knows more about ethnobiology and some other person knows more about how to cook beetroot well. The problem remains, though, that this understanding of knowledge is too narrow to capture all this diversity that we spoke about a moment ago, which is why recently there has been a strong push in all corners of social science, as well as some branches of philosophy, to include a different type of inquiry in the pluralism of knowledge debate. So ontology, again in the tradition of Western philosophy, stands for an inquiry into the basic nature of things, so to understand what is being said. So knowledge diversity in this context, it's not just that knowing agents know different things, but that the things that they know about differ from each other on some more basic level. Some go as far as to proclaim that these different knowers inhabit different worlds with different kinds of beings, etc. So for example, perhaps the mangrove, which is the home of the Ceribinha community members, is a different mangrove, in fact, than the one described by scientists in a stuffy room at an academic conference. So on the slide, I listed some of the concepts which appear in the ontological discourse on pluralism. And I spent the last couple of years now, actually, trying to understand the strong ontological view on knowledge diversity. And coming from philosophy, I wanted to organize in my mind, what does this mean when an anthropologist says that some community inhabits an ontologically different reality? And somewhat by accident, I must admit, this curiosity developed into an entire article. And here is the result. The paper was published very recently in July. And it is part of the collection on metametaphysics of social ontology in Synthèse, which is a journal of analytic philosophy. And as I mentioned, was co-authored by my supervisor, David Ludwig. So here are some key results that we put forth in the article. So firstly, we aimed to provide a nuanced diagnosis of the relations between ontological discourses across philosophy and anthropology, which led us to a definition of ontology. This is a long sentence. As a heuristic used in anthropology for engaging with collective dependent, knowledge-making, self-determined interpretative domains. And we also proposed a classification of ontology-related works in both disciplines. And the big question is, why did we go through all this trouble? And we did so to show that this diagnosis can foster interdisciplinary communication and dialogue in the context of knowledge diversity considerations. And to argue that this is possible, we took two case studies, so two debates in philosophy and social science, namely ontological gerrymandering and relativism and social ontology. And we analyzed them using our interdisciplinary approach. So this is the summary slide. So hopefully all will become more clear throughout this presentation. Due to time constraints, I will skip the social ontology case study entirely. So if that's your area of interest, I apologize, and I would be happy to discuss it with you at another time. So please just feel free to reach out to me. Okay, so firstly, in the first step of our investigation was a review on the literature which could be broadly classified as ontological anthropology. And I think it's important to know that we took this to be broader than just the ontological term, which for those unfamiliar with the phrase is a kind of a select group of anthropologists explicitly aligning themselves with the idea of ontological diversity. So instead, we reviewed works of many authors for whom the common thread is a criticism of what is called the dualist nature-culture metaphysical framework. And I'm not going to go too deep into this, but what this amounts to is that the epistemological view on diversity, which I discussed before, needs to be reevaluated mostly for these reasons that I explained, that it just is unable to capture diverse forms of knowledge and expertise. So we identified 3 levels in which this reevaluation is carried out by ontological anthropology. And firstly, methodologically, if we take difference just to mean that knowing or believing different things, then it's easy to distort what a person is saying during an ethnographic interview. So suppose that someone is telling you a story about how they were kidnapped by the caipora. And for those who don't know, caipora is a forest being, a forest spirit present across Brazil, and it inhabits forests and kidnaps those who don't behave well towards nature. And if, as an ethnographer, I would say that the person who's telling me their story believes that they were kidnapped, I already distort what was told because they don't tell me that they believe that this happened to them. They tell me that this has happened to them. And if I say that they believe that it happened, I already distort what was told, and therefore I would invisibilize their experience. So this is a methodological problem because as you know, as an anthropologist or as an ethnographer, my task is to tell the story as accurately as possible. But this is also a problem at the epistemic level, because then I would commit an act of what's called testimonial injustice. So I would deny someone their ability to be a knowledge producer and to share with me the accurate description of what had happened to them. So finally, at the political level, I would deny this person telling me their story their right to self-determine the description of their experience and to be a producer of reliable knowledge, and thus deny their political agency with my dominant view of spirits as non-existent, as in something that can only be an object of belief, but never of knowledge. So let us situate these abstract distinctions in a concrete case study, such as the debates around rights of nature. So rivers are among the non-human entities that have become increasingly treated as legal persons with their own rights and responsibilities. The framing of rivers as persons is commonly motivated by local and indigenous ontologies and their role in fostering sustainable relations between people and rivers. And recognizing rights of nature therefore brings together alternative ontological framings and governance practices that challenge dominant modernist perspectives on rivers as passive natural resources without agency of their own. So here we have all of these 3 levels of methodology, the epistemic level and the political level. So what we did, having reviewed this literature, so yeah, exactly with these 3 interventions in mind, we carried out a conceptual analysis of this concept of ontology in anthropology. So what we first noticed was that rather than ontology being a kind of a consistently used concept, it can be described as more of a heuristic, meaning that there's no one concept which accurately describes what ontology stands for, but rather it is related to a more complex web of concepts. That's why this definition is very long, and I apologize. We tried to make it more simple, but this is the best we could do. And if somebody has suggestions how to make it more simple, I would be really open to hearing those. So we propose that the heuristic of ontology and anthropology is used for engaging with collective dependent, meaning that different human collectives use different ones, knowledge making, self-determined interpretative domains, where the last three aspects of the definition correspond directly to those three levels of interventions explained on the previous slide. So again, kind of not to linger in the abstract for too long, let us go back to the case study of rivers as persons. So many anthropologists would approach personhood of rivers through the plurality of interpretative domains. So from, for example, the Magpie of the Yamuna or the Wanui River. Such an approach focuses on interpretative domains and their dependency on local collectives, rather than asking generalized philosophical questions about the justification of ontological claims about rivers. So instead of treating a river as person as a suspicious belief that requires external validation, anthropologists will therefore focus on how river ontologies shape local knowledge-making practices. For example, the personhood of rivers may be explored in its capacity to shape relations of care and commitment between community and rivers. Such relations will be partly epistemic, through situated knowledge of issues such as the river's seasonal behavior, its capacity to support livelihood practices with fish or water, and its dangers associated with floods and rapids. The relations may also be deeply normative and thus politically potent in the sense that they ground a moral order of relations between community and river that is radically different from modernist framings of rivers as passive objects that lack agency and need to be managed for sustainable resource extraction. So moving on to our interdisciplinary approach. On the other hand, for philosophers, the framing of rivers as persons may raise questions about ontological commitments and their justification. So coming back to that traditional Western philosophical definition of ontology is the study of the basic nature of being. So a philosopher might ask, if an indigenous community considers a river a person, does that entail an ontological commitment to rivers as intentional actors? Or is there a different concept of personhood involved that does not require intentionality? So there's all these other sorts of questions that a philosopher might ask. So when we kind of moving on through the article, when we debated all of this, we performed what could be called a comparative analysis. So how, what are these different questions that ontological anthropology and ontology and philosophy might ask? And we made this summary as that ontological anthropology focuses on methodological, epistemic, and political concerns that arise from encounters between radically different collectives. And we observed that while both anthropologists and philosophers have become increasingly concerned with ontological plurality, they often approach this plurality in strikingly different ways, right? Because we have these type of concerns on the side of ontological anthropology and these more, let's say, traditional philosophical concerns with validity and justification on the side of philosophy. And so these are the differences. So we did observe a big diversity in these ontological discourses in both disciplines. But then we also asked ourselves, what are the similarities? And indeed, we observed an important parallel between the two discourses. So what we propose is to kind of take this observation at face value. So let me now explain what we observed. So in anthropology, we can make a distinction between what we call first order ontological claims about the world, such as, for instance, that rivers are persons. So this would be a first order claim about the world. This is a fact in the world that rivers are persons. Some, but not all anthropologists are interested in making such definite claims about how the world is. Others make what we call second order claims about ontologies, such as, for instance, that there are communities for which rivers are persons. So this is a statement about ontologies themselves and not about the world. So there is this distinction. And interestingly, a similar distinction exists in philosophy as well. Ontology per se is a type of philosophical inquiry which is concerned with these first order claims about the world. For instance, a big question for philosophers remains whether abstract objects exist. But there is also a new branch of philosophy called meta-ontology, and this branch of philosophy investigates ontological frameworks in a similar way that second order claims are made in anthropology. So it is this parallel actually between the two discourses which will be the basis of our interdisciplinary investigations. So let me show you this classification in a bit more detail. So next slide it's very packed and very yeah, it's full of names. We just wanted to, so this is explained a bit better in the paper, but I just wanted to show you that we proposed this classification between first and second order claims. And we observed a kinship between ontology and alternative ontologies on one hand, and meta-ontology and the pluralist ontological turn on the other. Through this parallel, we aim to show that the meanings of ontology in anthropology and philosophy are in fact related, and not just a case of homonymy. And the relations we described between first and second order considerations open opportunities for fruitful intellectual exchange and show how debates about ontological plurality in anthropology and philosophy can be mutually enriching. So the clarity with respect to the meaning of ontology and anthropology that our conceptual analysis facilitates can be seen as a vehicle to engage in these cross-disciplinary debates while decreasing the risk of mutual misunderstanding. And now I will show how this strategy can be applied in practice in order to demonstrate the claim that entanglement of issues of diversity, interpretation, knowledge, and self-determination heuristically addressed in the ontological anthropology can bring about new developments in philosophical debates. So I'm just going to show you that on a case study. So the first part of the paper kind of develops this classification and this conceptual analysis. And then we showed two case studies of how these interdisciplinary investigations can be put forth. So the case study that I want to show you today is the case of ontological gerrymandering. And this debate began with the Volgar and Pavluk's 1985 paper entitled Ontological Gerrymandering, the Anatomy of Social Problems Explanations. You have here on the right. And first, before I get into the analysis, let me tell you a little bit about this concept of gerrymandering. So I will tell you actually a little anecdote on how this first came about. So the word itself is a combination of the name Jerry and the animal salamander. And it was first used in 1812 in the Boston Gazette in a reaction to a redrawing of Massachusetts Senate election districts under Governor Elbridge Gerry. So the term comes from his name. And the word is still used in political discourse to describe unfair classification of populations into electoral districts. And this is not very important for us to understand precisely how it goes. But if you just quickly take a look at the picture on the right side, you can see that there's a population which has certain preferences. So 60% of people in this group have a certain preference, and 40% have different ones. But if you then need to make kind of a group selection based on these grouping into districts, you can actually manipulate the final outcomes. So you can group people in particular ways that kind of shifts the overall preference of the group. So what is just important for us is to kind of have this idea of gerrymandering in your mind, that kind of groupings can be done in different ways, and these groupings have, and these ways or these final groupings have important consequences. So in the philosophical context, gerrymandering, as described in the original paper, refers to a tendency of social scientists working in the constructivist paradigm to treat some things as given and some as constructed, without sufficiently explaining why that is the case. So, for instance, in many debates, we talk about constructivism as this method, almost a metaphysical concern or approach, that kind of there are no facts, there is no truth, and then everything is constructed. But then, for instance, constructivism itself is what we agree on, so that's a given. So in the original paper, the concern is that it represents a sort of selective relativism. So why are certain things treated as given, and why are certain things treated as constructed, or things that can be questioned? It wasn't clear. So in the paper, we proposed that the ontological gerrymandering debate could be reconsidered via the lens of ontological anthropology, using this this anthropological understanding of ontology. So on the level of first order claims, the philosophical debate on ontological gerrymandering could be enriched through the exploration of the methodological, the epistemic, and the political phases of the concept of ontology. And in this way, it could be investigated why certain aspects of reality are understood as given and others as constructed. So these questions include who is included and who is excluded from determining which aspects of reality should be treated as given and which should be questioned. Or in other words, who are the agents of this ontological gerrymandering? So what kinds of knowledge is produced, and what methodologies are complicit in engaging in gerrymandering strategies? And these considerations can shed new light on the phenomenon of ontological gerrymandering, and consequently contribute to a broadening of philosophical debates concerning social constructivism. And again, to kind of come back to our example of rivers as persons, so we can think about the status quo, so the governance of rivers as inanimate, non-agential objects, can be reconsidered from this point of view of why that is the case. Why do we keep the status quo, and why this idea of river as inanimate is treated as something as a given, but then there are so many other ideas that can be debated or can be changed. So this is kind of this could really enrich that debate from a philosophical perspective. And on the side of second order claims, so if we treat ontological gerrymandering as a second order problem, so a problem about ontologies themselves, not something that exists in the world per se, one can object to the selective relativism present in constructivism, exposed by the ontological gerrymandering argument, to argue that no aspect of reality should be treated as given. So in this way, the pluralist ontological turn, so the second order type of ontological anthropology, overcomes the ontological gerrymandering difficulty by refusing to accept any boundary between the given and the questionable, but rather placing everything in this realm of something that can be experimented with, questioned, etc. So to conclude, in the words of Tim Ingold, who has inspired a lot of this work, anthropology is akin to philosophy, but differs from philosophy, at least as practiced by the majority of professional philosophers, in that it does its philosophizing in the world, in conversation with diverse inhabitants, rather than in arcane reflections on an already established literary canon. So in the article, we aimed to bring the two debates on ontology closer together to challenge both sides, and to learn from each other. Our own methodological approach can be described as engaged practical philosophy, where philosophical research meets current pressing societal issues. With the conceptual clarity brought about through our investigation, we hope to stimulate interdisciplinarity in debates of knowledge diversity, where inclusivity of diverse perspectives is our driving commitment. So as a final remark, let me just preview that as of right now, I moved on from these questions, and now I'm trying to relate it all back to this knowledge diversity context more directly. And in an applied context, I will investigate the empirical validity of all of these theoretical considerations, and I hope to have an opportunity to discuss them with you again when I am ready and I have some thoughts on the subject. But for now, let me just thank you for being here once again, and I look forward to answering all of your questions. Thank you.